Yeah, I think that's one of the more important parts of entering into the text and entering into the depth of the text is being willing to emotionally enter into the scene of a widow who lost her son and the trauma of a widow who lost her son. And some of the depth of the passage is lost. The nuance of the story is lost if you do not first do that. And you approach the story as some intellectual exercise or try to just start mining out little like nuggets of truth without entering in first to the emotional state and trauma of the setting. I've experienced my fair share of funerals. I'm sure we all have. My sophomore year of college, I remember waking up on a Saturday morning to a phone call from my dad telling me my grandmother had passed from a long journey with Alzheimer's. And it's just the way my dad is. It was one of the first members of my family who had passed know what was happening. I'd been to funerals before for close family members, but I was too young. I don't even barely remember them. And this was the first time that I was in college. I totally got it. And my dad called me, and I just said, "Hey, what's up?" And my dad never calls me, so I knew something was going on. And it was early in the morning, and so I knew something was wrong. And he said the way that he put it, which will characterize him and characterize how he was receiving it. He said, "Grandma went home to mow lawns with Jesus." Because it was one of her favorite it was one of her favorite things to hop on the riding mower and just mow, even if the yard didn't even need mowed. Just hop on the lawnmower and mow. And that's kind of how, because she had suffered for so long with this battle of Alzheimer's, and because she had so many other things building upon that, it was kind of expected. We saw it coming, and I mean, some of you have experienced this, but when it happens, you're sad, but there's also this little bit of relief that the suffering is over, and this little bit of relief that you can celebrate her life and where she's gone. And but I still remember when we were between the funeral service in the church and driving from the church to the burial, our whole family, I have an older sister, older brother, younger brother, our whole family just sat in this minivan. We were driving to the burial, and we all just cried the whole time. And that setting has never happened with my family. I mean, we're very Midwest, and that's kind of stuff does not happen, but it was so overwhelming. We were all just crying in this van. I'll never forget, it's vivid for me. I'll never forget that. Because even though we were able to be a little bit relieved that the suffering was over and even be able to celebrate her life, there's still the tragedy of the loss and the void of her being gone now and wrestling with what that means. Even though her death was expected, it was still painful. My wife's grandfather just died a couple years ago, and their family, my family's kind of non-emotional and close, but not whole extended family crazy close. But my wife's family's the opposite. I mean, it's whole family reunions every single weekend, and everybody's really, really close, and everybody wears their emotions on their sleeves a little bit. It's very different for me. And 2 years ago, my wife's grandfather passed away, and he was kind of this staple of the family, and everybody really loved him. And I will never forget being in the service when everybody had kind of gone through, and the casket was in the church. Everybody had gone through, and it was just the family in the church. And I just almost felt because I wasn't nearly as connected to him, I almost felt like I was on the outside looking into this. I mean, there's just so much sorrow. So much sadness. And again, he had battled a long-term thing with Parkinson's. And there was still that thing, that end of the suffering. And there was still that thing that we can celebrate his life and we know where he's gone. But there was still this tragic loss. And this kind of just outpouring of sorrow at the loss. That level of tragedy and sorrow that happens at any funeral for any encounter with death is amplified when the natural order is reversed and parents have to bury their kids. It is different. It is heavy. it's advanced. It's exponentially heavier in the room in the season when parents have to bury their kids. That level of pain, even for me now as a father, is unimaginable. It's so much harder for me now to watch like movies where parents lose their kids and have I used to watch that stuff and be like, yeah, that's kind of sad, almost empathetic with it. But now it's like I can feel it. And I don't like watching those anymore. I can't imagine it. And there are few pains in this world that can compare to a mother who loses a child. That type of pain is given so much respect in this world. Everybody understands it, that a whole town will shut down for it. And I've experienced that. This isn't like just a random thing that happened in ancient Near East times where like a whole community will kind of come around a processional and kind of like be involved in this thing. I've experienced that. I come from a smaller town. The town I grew up in was 3,600 people, if you can believe that. Nope, can't believe it. I grew up for 18 years in a town, 3,600 people. And 3 times in middle school and high school, there were kids who were killed in car accidents that I was good friends with. And I had to hug mothers who had lost their kids 3 times. I will never forget anyone would shut down. Nothing would be open. The first time it ever happened, I was in 5th grade, and one of my best friends' older sister who was in high school died in a car accident. So I was like, just barely old enough to understand what was happening. And my mom called me and told me what happened, and I was still just kind of processing it. And she died, and then the processional was at this little country church on the outside of town in the middle of nowhere. It could only fit maybe 75 people in it. And my dad and I went. It was just us 2. And we got there 15 minutes early because we thought it might be a little bit crowded. And it was outside of the church by the time we got there. And I got there and we were just kind of like standing outside. You couldn't really hear anything. And some of the people knew that I was close to the family. And so they let me just kind of like sneak in the back door. And I was just standing just inside of the church in the back and just watched this whole thing happen. And I remember like weeping as a 5th grader, but it wasn't because I really totally understood. It was because I was being like, I was being caught up by the outcry of the whole room. I was being caught up in the tragedy and the sorrow of the whole room. And eventually they started walking. They didn't have this thing where everybody walked by the casket. It would have been too much. So they just kind of like walked the casket out while everybody was still there. And then you could kind of funnel your way out. Well, I'm standing right by the door, the back door. And this whole kind of, my friend, my 5th grade friend was one of the pallbearers for his own sister. And they're kind of walking down this aisle, and the mother is leading that procession in front of the casket. And when I saw her, it wasn't anyone else. When I saw her, I lost it. It's a type of pain that you cannot comprehend, but you will respect. 2 weeks ago, I stepped out of my office, right out here in the office classrooms, and there was some tables and chairs set up out here, and I stepped outside, and sitting in one of the chairs is a woman named Deanna Joseph. And she leads a microchurch in the underground called Andrew Soares Mission. And basically what happened is her son, her 14-year-old son died 2 years ago. And she's building this ministry around supporting parents who lose their kids, but also advocating for policies and procedures to prevent what happened to her son. And they've had a few events here, and she was back there at those tables and chairs, and I walked out. I'd never met her before. And so I didn't know what she looked like. And so I kind of walked out of my office. I was running to a meeting, and she was like, "Hey, are you the new guy?" I said, "Yeah, I'm the new guy. Some people call me that. I also have a name. It's yeah, I'm Lucas." And I kind of met her, and she said, "I'm Deanna." And I immediately knew who she was, and I just said, "I am so inspired by your work. I love what you do. We're with you." And she said, "How are you and your family?" She just kind of did this offhanded thing where she said, "How are you and your family adjusting?" And I said, my wife, I talked about my wife a little bit, and then I talked about my son, my 2-year-old son, Landon. And I said, he's got all these new things to do in the city, and he loves it so much or whatever. And she did not miss a beat. She looked at me right in the face, and she said, take more pictures. I will never forget. Sorry. This widow isn't just burying her son, she's doing it alone. It's one thing to lose a family member. It's one kind of pain to lose a family member. It's a different kind of pain for a parent to bury a child, and it's a different kind of pain for a parent to have to bury a child after burying her husband. To do it alone. And it's a different thing to do it in a cultural climate where without a male to cover you, to care for you, you're consigned to poverty. She's looking at a future of abject poverty, a future of depending upon public charity. She has no advocacy for herself. This is perhaps the most painful, tiresome, hopeless situation Jesus could have entered, could have stumbled into. And Luke is always intentional. You got to start learning these little things about how Luke writes as we're going through this. Luke is always intentional about his historical and geographic markers. When he mentions times or he mentions places, he never wastes it. It's on purpose. It's for a reason. This little town called Nain is only mentioned this one time in all the Gospels. This story is only located in this Gospel out of the 4. It's a 6-mile journey southeast of Nazareth and almost a day out of the way of what most historical commentators believed was Jesus' intentional travel route, what he was trying to do. He went out of his way to go here. And there would have been no reason for Jesus to go to Nain, a small, know-nothing town southeast of Nazareth. There would have been no reason. And this is why I don't think Jesus accidentally up in a small town and accidentally stumbled into a funeral procession. I think he knew that this was happening this day. Because Jesus always goes looking for the most hopeless, the devastated, the suffering, the vulnerable. It is his MO. It's what he does. Looking for them, pursuing them, finding them, being with them. And he had never raised a dead person to life before this scene. And this would have been a probing of the power of Jesus, a testing of his ability to follow through on his promise. Blessed are those who are weeping, for you will laugh. How much can you follow through on that promise? This is maybe the greatest test he has faced. He could have he didn't have to just raise the guy from the dead. There's a lot of things he could have done when he stumbled into this scene. He could have just wept with her. He could have counseled her. He could have joined in with the proceedings and stood in solidarity. He could have called a town meeting to make sure that she was cared for, that somebody would feel responsible for her. He could have blessed her in some way. No. Instead, he raised a dead body to life. And let's not run quickly through that. That would have been terrifying, like we talked about. Fear would have seized them all. I mean, if I was there, I would have been completely terrified, absolutely terrified. There wouldn't have been any coming up to Jesus and saying, man, that was so cool what you did back there. Really kind of you, very kind. Thank you for that. Thank you for doing that. No. There's none of that. There probably wasn't even a wholesale approach to Jesus. I would have been totally terrified, absolutely terrified. There maybe were some people in the room who were doubting. Maybe. We don't have any writing of that, but there may be some people in there. Was he really dead? Was the guy really dead? Was he asleep? Because this isn't possible. He was probably alive. This is a show. There's no way that this is happening. Who's that doctor? Whose doctor did this? I'm not taking my kids to that doctor anymore. What a terrible doctor. You know what? The one person in the scene who probably wasn't terrified? The mother. because her fear would have been overridden by joy in the embrace of her son and the restoration of her family and the hope restored of her future. The one piece of this story that is so striking, so unique to me, as we mentioned before, is the nameless widow that is noticeably silent. We have so little detail about her, so little information, so little interaction. She does not speak a word. We don't even get to see how she responds. Jesus isn't provoked to come by her. He isn't sent an invitation, anything when he arrives. Maybe she didn't know who Jesus was or what he was capable of. But I doubt it. Because almost every time so far in the narrative, whenever Jesus does something miraculous or amazing, what does it say? Word about him spread throughout the countryside and the region. I think I'd be hard-pressed to believe that she doesn't know anything about who this person is and what he's done. I think she probably knows. But we're always going to have a cap on what we believe God can do, is capable of, or what we'll entrust him to. There's probably things actually in your life right now or in the past that were extremely difficult that you did not entrust to Jesus because, one, you didn't think he cared, or two, you didn't think he was capable to change it. And I think maybe, just maybe, he's never risen a person from the dead before. She probably knows he's got some incredible teachings. He's done some miraculous stuff before, but not this. This is above his pay grade. He can't touch this. Does he even care? First of all, does he care? And two, is he even powerful enough to do anything about it? And the widow shows no evidence of hope, only evidence of despair and an acceptance of misery. But the point of the whole story, listen, the point of the whole story isn't to tell you, you should have more faith, you should believe God can do more, you should believe God can do the miraculous beyond anything you could ask or think. You should have a better prayer life, ask him to do things more. I mean, if you asked, when's the last time you asked somebody to heal you? Ask for them to heal, you know what? Like, why don't you ask God to do things that you don't think he's capable of? That's not the point of the story. The point of the story is that God works when he is not asked. That he is active when you don't believe. That he is faithful when you are faithless. It's not about you, actually. This story is about him, what he does, his disposition towards you. His activity is not triggered by our big faith or our persistence or our deservedness or our work or the way we eloquently craft our request, but by compassion. He is activated by his compassion for you, regardless of how you ask, regardless of if you ask. That word passion means to suffer. A thing that you are passionate about is something that you will suffer for, something that you are willing to suffer for. And that word compassion is to suffer with. Sometimes we confuse empathy and compassion. We might read this text and think, oh, God was empathetic toward her. God had sympathy for her. But that's not it. That's not enough. To be empathetic, to have empathy, is to cognitively understand what someone is feeling. To have a good IQ, a good emotional IQ, and then to have sympathy for how a person is feeling. But to have compassion is not just to understand what a person is feeling, but to feel it with them. To be able to enter into that suffering, to feel that suffering with them. To not be distant from it and just understand it and offer some sympathy, but to actually feel it with them. Compassion is actually to take on the fullness of that emotional experience. And you don't have compassion for those you are not predisposed to love. Intimacy precedes compassion. And this is perhaps the more profound good news for this widow. That God didn't cause this. That God didn't long for it. That God does not convene with death. He does not partner with death. but he's with her. He maintains no distance from her suffering. He joins her in her suffering. He feels it with her. And he's so motivated by that compassion. He says, "Do not weep," and he raises him to life. Compassion is actually maybe the first piece of good news before the resurrection of her son. You see, the resurrection of her son does not happen without compassion. And in that day and age, in that time, of course she's going to be feeling like God is punishing me. God is not with me. I've lost my husband. I've lost my son. I've lost everything. I'm consigned to misery the rest of my life. God is not with me. He's distant from me. He does not love me, does not care for me. But for Jesus to step in and to feel, as the fullness of God in the flesh, to feel her suffering, and to be so motivated by that compassion for her without her even requesting, to say, I have to do something. I have to work. I have to work here. I cannot let this stand. I cannot let this be. Jesus is not moved to be merciful by our faith, nor by our knowledge, nor by our potential, nor by our request, nor even by our humility. He is moved by his love for us. God is stirred by unwarranted love to display limitless mercy towards you. And that is unchanged. That has been determined. His disposition to you has been determined. And the only thing that changes is whether or not you're going to receive it or not. His mercies are new every morning. Are you going to take them or not? That disposition of him toward you is there. It's been established. I was a part of, for several years, I was a part of a seminary cohort out of Fuller Theological Seminary with about 25 full-time ministry people from around the world, and pastors, worship leaders, kids directors, nonprofit people, church planters, whatever. But we had a handful of missionaries from around the world that were actually in parts of the world that we can't talk about. We're not allowed to talk about. And these people had stories that I just wanted to sit with. I didn't even want to learn seminary anymore. I just wanted to cancel the class. Can we just stop this and sit down and just have these people tell their stories? That's all I wanted. It was the gem of the degree for me, was meeting these people. And one of the guys that was a part of our cohort was a guy, I'm going to use an alias. We'll call him Bill. And he was working in a Middle Eastern war-torn country where Christianity is heavily persecuted, and he can't talk about where he's working. And we were kind of like just going around sharing, what do you do, and what have highs and lows, highs and lows. You guys done highs and lows? What's God really done in your life that's great, and then what's not been good, and everybody, it's like this first day introductory stuff, and I'm just like, here's, I'm Lucas, and I'm from Illinois, and here's what's been going great, whatever. Well, it gets around to Bill, and he's like, hey, I'm Bill, and I plant hospitals in this war-torn country because I'm not allowed to do ministry, so I have to be there on a work visa to do medical work. And we plant hospitals, and then we do church planting through the hospital. So I basically just save people's lives, and then I tell them about Jesus, and then if they believe and they want to follow Jesus, I'll funnel them into these underground house churches. And highs, he tells a couple highs, and then he's like, lows. I was forced out of the country in the middle of the night because the hospital was going to get raided by the government, and I didn't want to leave my people because I really loved them, but they forced me to leave in the middle of the night, and I just found out a couple weeks ago that it did get raided, and 90% of my staff were executed, and I'm stuck here, and I decided to take this program because I'm bored. Yeah, I'm Lucas, and I'm from Illinois, and I don't really know what to say here. I don't know what to talk about here. The guy was, anytime he talked, he was so full of these just incredible stories of God's faithfulness in his life. And on the last day, I got breakfast with him, and we were just kind of swapping, tell me about some of the most profound things God has done, or what. if you're like close to leaving ministry, what's the one story that God brings to your mind to keep you? You know, just questions like that. I just want to pick his brain. And at the end of that meeting, he was basically, the reason I thought about this is because he was talking about this text. He was talking about how the vision of what they were doing was to plant hospitals and have, hopefully, people come in with their whole families. Because people don't come in just as individuals in that culture. They, like, their whole family just takes off whatever they got to do, work. Everybody comes in for, like, the one person who's, like, dying or sick. And his vision was, like, I want to offer medical care to be able to tell families, do not weep. And then I can use my skills as a doctor to arise their loved ones. And then share with them how God is merciful to you even when you are not asking him to be. And even when you know nothing about him. And even when you don't have any intimacy with him. He is actually mercifully at work in your life. And he called me to be here, to be with you, to extend to you his mercy. And he would use medical care in that way to invite not just individuals, but entire families to respond to Jesus. And when at the end of that meeting with him over breakfast, I was just asking him, how can I pray for you? You know, because I'm not going to see you for another 2 years or whatever until we see each other again. And he said, I've been trying for months to get back into the country. Can you pray that God would allow me to get back to my hospital? Can you conceive what he's asking? I must get back to my hospital where I no longer have any staff who were executed for their stance on the gospel. I must get back to that work because I'm called to it, and I can't stand being here. And I must be faithful to that work, and I believe God has me to be there. To extend mercy to those who are not asking for it, do not deserve it, who have an absence of faith, to extend God's mercy to them. 3 months later, we got a Facebook message from Bill, who said that they found a way back into the country. And he and his wife were going to be traveling back into the country. And everybody was very excited, at the same time a little bit worried about him, but very excited for them. And they moved back in, and 6 months later he died. And his lovely wife is still alive, and she let our whole cohort know that he had died. But he died as a representation of the relentless mercy of God to people not asking for it. To people who did not believe, who do not deserve it, who are not even looking for God. And he is a representation of God's relentless pursuit, compassion, and love for those people. To call a man like that, to do a work like that, was the joy of his life. And the reason it was the joy of his life to extend that type of unwarranted mercy is because he was so in tune with his own reception of that unwarranted mercy. That he had received a divine pursuit of God that he was not asking for. Worship team, if you guys want to come up, I want to finish with this last nagging thought from this text on my mind. Jesus comes with few words, but his words are so potent. Do not weep, but arise. One word, he approaches a woman who is destitute, suffering, vulnerable, sorrowful, in despair, and he has 3 words: do not weep. The scandal, the insanity of those 3 words in that moment: do not weep. And he raises a man from death to life with one word, one declarative claim: arise. Arise. Back in 2010, we started having this dinner in the streets in Carbondale, in the town that I moved here from. And we had this community of people that were wanting to be, our vision was to be family with the poorest in our city. That's all we wanted. We wanted to be family with the most vulnerable in our city. And we just thought the only way to get there maybe is just to provide dinner. We weren't just trying to feed people. We wanted to be family. So we just started bringing dinner to the streets, which was totally illegal, and we just did it anyways. Well, we didn't know at the time, so we weren't knowingly breaking the law. So, that's how we decided to do things: make a crock pot of barbecue, a couple pizzas, take them to the streets, and have dinner with people, and then just hear their stories, talk with them, share about our hope and trust in Jesus, ask them about their story, ask them how they see God at work in their life, sit on the curb, bear each other's burdens. And we did that for over a year, and we really became tight-knit with this group of people. And there was one guy who was there on the first night and was with us the whole way through. His name was Tag. It was his street name was Tag. He had a different real name, we found out later. But he hammered drunk, out of his mind drunk, every single time we saw him. Every time. We did not see him sober for 7 months. And every single time we saw him, he was very ornery, funny. I mean, would joke at our expense, but also like laugh with us. And he would tell us, for the first few months, he would just tell us everything that he knew about the Bible because he thought that would just get him more stuff, like we would stay around longer. He's just such an ornery guy, and we just really loved this guy. We fell in love with this guy. And eventually, after we knew him for about 4 months, he got sent to the county jail because he stabbed a guy. He got in a fight outside of a establishment, and it was kind of self-defense, but he stabbed a guy. And so he went to the county jail, and that's when we started going to the county jail every single week during visiting hours and just sitting across the glass from him, just making sure he was okay. We made sure that he had enough money on his prison account to have postage to send us letters back and forth. And I have all these in my office. I have this folder of all these letters with him. And he would send a letter, and at the end of the letter, he would list the name of every single person that was a part of our crew. Thanks so much for writing me. And he would have all these Bible verses, and I'm so encouraged by the Lord in this season. And he would say, tell everybody, bye. And he would have a personalized message for every single person, like 8 or 9 people. And we would just kind of read this to the community. Well, we were running this every week dinner soup kitchen. And one night we were having dinner with people, and he just walks in the room. We didn't know that he'd gotten out. And he walks in the room, and he's really clean cut. He's got a button-up shirt. He's got some jeans on, some slacks. And he's, we've never seen him like this. He's crazy sober. He's talking very serious. And we just didn't even know how to take him. He's a totally different person. And he said, I just wanted to say bye to you guys, and I'm so thankful for all you've done and for investing in me and kind of paving the way for me to be reconciled to Jesus and trying to follow him again. I need to go to Louisiana to check into a Christian alcohol rehab facility, a 6-month rehab facility. And I was like, that's a really good idea, but I think there's more of those, not in Louisiana. I think there's some here. There might be some here. And he said, well, I have a wife and 3 kids in Louisiana. And he had been living drunk in the streets of Carbondale in a box for 10 years. And he had a wife and kids sitting in Louisiana that he just left. He ran away from because of shame and because of all these other things. And we were just I was stunned. We didn't know any of this. And we ended up getting him a train ticket to go down to Louisiana. And for about 3 years, every 2 or 3 times a year, I would just get these calls from numbers that I didn't recognize. And I would answer them, and it would be tagged just on payphones because he wrote down my number. And he would call, and he would just be like, hey, man, I just wanted to update you. He'd talk to me about his wife and his kids. He would ask me how I'm doing. He would ask how Leanne's doing. He would ask how, everybody, he would ask people that I hadn't even talked to for years. He'd be like, how are they doing? What's going on with them? And he just wanted to know everything. And he was always, in relational connection with us. And we kind of lost. He stopped calling. And 2 years later, I got a collect call on my cell phone from the county jail in Carbondale. And it was Tag. And he said, hey, I don't have a lot of time. Can you just come get me? And he said he's going to leave the jail and start walking to Carbondale. The jail's about 15 minutes outside of town. He said he's just going to start walking. I can pick him up halfway. So I got in my car, and I was just full of questions, why are you here? What are you doing? How did this happen? And I start driving toward the jail. I find him it's just pouring rain outside, cut loose pouring rain outside. And I find him on the side of the road, and he gets in my car. He's just soaking wet. And we just start driving back to Carbondale, and we say nothing, and we just cry all the way back to Carbondale. And I would try to ask him a question, and he just could not speak. And he would just cry. And I would try to encourage him, and he would not receive it. He would just cry. And he had the gusto. He had this little place where he used to live that was like this little alleyway between a laundromat and a liquor store. And he said to me, he looked me in the face, he said, "Can you take me home?" Referring to that place. And we just cried. And we get to that place, we park the car, and I try to get him talking a little bit, and he's just so ridden with shame, he just would not talk to me. He was drunk. He basically had just gone on a bender, left his family again, found his way back to the place he felt was comfortable, and wound up in jail. He'd been in Carbondale for 4 or 5 months, and just hiding from us. And we didn't know. And he wanted to just get out of my car and just go sit in this alleyway and not talk to me. And I just said, "I'm not going to override your will. You can do whatever you want. But I have not lost hope in you, because God has not lost hope in you. I have not lost hope in your redemption, in your renewal, in your restoration, because God's disposition of love and compassion has not changed for you. It is set, it is established. And you can wallow around in shame if you want, that's fine, but I have not lost hope, and I happen to know that God specializes in making dead things alive. That's what he does. That's his work. So do not lose heart. And to this day, I can't keep myself from answering unknown numbers on my phone. It might be him. Underground, this is the work that we do. This is the work that we must do. This is the work that if we quit doing, we will leave. We'll shut it down. We take detours to Nain. We run into the funerals of our world. We find the processions of pain and sorrow. We find the vulnerable. We reach into the domain of death and we declare, "Arise." We find the margins. We find the desperate. We find the people who are not asking, are not searching, have no faith, are absent of faith, and we step into that domain of death and we find them and we say, "Arise. Do not weep, arise." And people will not deserve that mercy. They will let you down. They will stab you in the back. They will use you up for what you offer. They will fail you. They'll turn on each other, and it does not change. It does not change the unrelenting mercy that we offer. We extend unwarranted mercy bathed in an unrelenting hope because we have received and keep receiving that mercy. So we reach our hand into hell itself. And anyone who would grab hold, we declare, "Do not weep, but arise." And one day we will all arise. One day we will all inherit resurrection. And every single funeral we go to is temporary now for people who follow it and trust their life to Jesus. Every funeral we go to is a little placation because they will receive their resurrection body. And you will see them again. They will inherit that victory. So do not weep. And our God is not inexperienced in the loss of a child, of a son, of an only son. That great pain, that profound trauma, he willfully entered that suffering on our behalf, moved in compassion to end our weeping, to call us all to arise. And Jesus demonstrated his victory over death and foreshadowed another son who would come and arise. A little over a year later, Jesus would conquer death in himself and offer a resurrection to all people who would trust in him. On the night he was betrayed at the table with his disciples, he took the bread and he broke it, saying, "This is my body, broken for you. And when you eat it, you remember the mercies of God, the disposition of God bestowed to you, the compassion of God toward you that sent him to the death of his body." And in the same way, he took the cup and poured it out, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, shed for the forgiveness of sin. And when you drink it, do so in remembrance of me." And underground, when you're ready, come to the table and remember the unrelenting, unwarranted, uncontrollable, limitless mercy of God toward you. When you're ready.